Instead, what I saw when I went out and investigated what life was like living in these cities or the outskirts of these cities that were served by these water treatment plants, I remember one place on the outskirts of Najaf where there was a village that was on that the city's main water system, and they basically already in January '04 they had 1 hour of electricity per 24 hours, and they had no running water in their homes. So this village, they had found where one of the water mains was underground nearby their village, and they literally dug 4 feet down into the dirt to find this pipe, break it open, and put in a little pipe sticking up about a foot, so that each day when that 1 hour of electricity ran and therefore the water would run, that 4-foot deep dirt hole would fill up with water, and that was then the village's main water source. So already back then in January '04 there was cholera, there was typhoid, there was waterborne diseases. Just about everyone I spoke with on this 3-day tour of these cities had either kidney stones or diarrhea or nausea or some sort of waterborne disease. The other water source for that particular village was a creek about a kilometer, about half a mile away, that the women of the village would take mules with big leather sacks on them and go down there and get water, of course untreated, and bring that back to the village. Also in this village, 8 children so far from this village alone. There was a factory across excuse me, the main highway nearby this village that actually had potable water. And this factory would, from time to time, give some of that water to the village. And so 8 children so far from this village alone had died trying to cross that highway to get water and bring it back to the village in this one place alone. Of course, Bechtel, as I'm sure most of you probably know, their initial contract of $680 million was no bid, cost plus, fixed fee, signed behind closed doors, awarded to them less than 1 week after the April 9th fall of Baghdad. Of course, there's George Shultz and his ties, and most of you probably know about this as well. But just one tiny small example of Bechtel. We have the Halliburtons, we have the Blackwater USAs, as Jeremy Scahill told us about yesterday. And Bechtel, of course, has pulled out of Iraq last November. They had been awarded payments for contracts totaling $2.3 billion. And they left last November because they said, well, it's just become too dangerous for us to work here. But I'm here to tell you that they left doing very, very little, if any, of the work that was specified in their contracts for them to do. And this is just one example of countless of contractor, literal corporate looting that had been going on in Iraq from the very beginning. I want to shift gears now and talk about Fallujah. Again, yesterday in Jeremy's talk, he did such an excellent job of giving us the history of Blackwater. And so I want to go a little bit more into depth of the level of propaganda that occurred in Fallujah immediately after the 4 Blackwater USA mercenaries were killed on March 31, 2004. First of all, a little background about Fallujah, that the city, according to a Human Rights Watch report, was actually not a pro-Saddam city before the invasion. That in fact Saddam Hussein himself, while many of his army officers lived there, overall the city wasn't very keen on his rule, and he never really tried to go in and absolutely take control of the city. He kind of made deals with some of the tribal leaders in the area and let it be. And a large percentage of the population of that city even considered themselves anti-Saddam Hussein. Another example of this is when the tanks rolled into Baghdad and when they rolled into Fallujah. In Fallujah, they weren't attacked. Not to say they were welcomed with flower petals and rose water and rice, but they weren't attacked. And tribal leaders of the city put forth their most pro-occupation tribal leader to actually try to work with the Coalition Provisional Authority and basically try to put their best foot forward to work within the occupation. and hopefully improve things in their city. But things went south really quick at the very end of April. So again, we're talking less than 3 weeks after the fall of Baghdad. U.S. forces occupied a school in Fallujah, and people demonstrated outside. It was a peaceful demonstration. Again, according to Human Rights Watch reports in the aftermath, the U.S. military claimed that they were fired upon in the school, and they responded. They fired back and killed 17 unarmed demonstrators and wounded dozens others. Of course, the Human Rights Watch report showed that there were no bullet marks anywhere on the school, i.e. the U.S. military wasn't fired on at all. So that basically ignited the resistance in the city, and it immediately became anti-occupation, and resistance attacks began and started to escalate rather quickly. So the Blackwater mercenaries and the U.S. military had been conducting operations in and around Fallujah for quite some time, up to the time that the four individuals were killed. And residents of the city had reported to me things like U.S. military personnel and in many cases people wearing civilian clothes or not military fatigues. Whether they were CIA or mercenaries is arguable, but people described that these folks were going around in the city doing massive home raids, massive amounts of detentions of people in the city, even carrying out assassinations within the city. And so when that was the situation that led up to the climate within the city when what happened on March 31st took place. So the four men were killed, as Jeremy Scahill talked about. They were, of course, as everyone in here knows, I'm sure you saw the pictures that were broadcast over and over of the burning vehicles, the burnt bodies chopped into pieces, mutilated, pieces of them hung from bridges, basically demonizing the entire city of Fallujah. 350,000 people, therefore, it was made to appear that 350,000 people were all completely responsible for what happened to these four guys. Not that it was an isolated resistance attack and then a relatively small group of people that carried out these atrocities. Of course, it wasn't reported that the atrocities were staunchly condemned by all the religious leaders and the tribal leaders in the city. They didn't condemn that these men were killed, let's be clear about that, but they all staunchly denounced what was done to their bodies afterwards, and then told the U.S. military, if you will give us time, we'll find the people responsible for what was done to these four men, and we'll bring them to you. Instead, the U.S., most of the mainstream media in the United States kicked it into high gear because the time was short for them to build a campaign for the Bush White House to go ahead and launch that siege of Fallujah. Although, again, like the invasion of Iraq itself, that was against the wishes of the military commanders on the ground in charge of Fallujah. They did not want to siege the entire city. That order did come directly from the White House. But in that short period of time between March 31st, when the attack on the Blackwater guys took place, and then the April 4, when the actual siege of the city was launched, there was a massive propaganda campaign launched. The U.S. so-called mainstream media called the Blackwater USA mercenaries consultants, contractors, security contractors, or civilians. And then what were they doing in Fallujah? According to the so-called mainstream media, on April 1st, the San Francisco Chronicle wrote that they were conducting, quote, food deliveries around Fallujah, end quote. As if they're ordering, delivering pizzas or something. The Washington Post, quote, they helped protect food convoys. The New York Times, quote, they provided security for food delivery in the Fallujah area, end quote. So from April 1st to 3rd, again, we're talking 72 hours that the corporate media has to really build the case for a full-scale assault on the city of Fallujah. So the men were even referred to as civilians, in quotes, 10 times in the LA Times, 9 times in the San Francisco Chronicle, 20 times in the Washington Post, 16 times in your Chicago Tribune, 25 times in the New York Times. So the 5 most respectable, most widely read papers in the United States referred to the men as American civilians 80 times in those 3 days. And then, of course, on April 4, the siege of Fallujah was launched. The city was surrounded and cordoned off by the U.S. military. I could talk for hours about things that happened during that siege and then the time period between the first and second sieges of Fallujah and then the second siege. But briefly, approximately 700 civilians, well, according to the Fallujah General Hospital, which I went in there after the April siege 3 different times, and according to doctors there, 736 civilians were killed during that siege. Well over 100 American soldiers were killed during that siege. Basically, the U.S. military couldn't take control of the city. They met far fiercer resistance than they expected. Not only were they being kept out of the city, but the resistance was launching counteroffensives against them. And if it weren't for air power, they would have been causing far, far higher number of casualties. So the U.S. backed off. Of course, while that siege was going on, interestingly enough, I managed to make it into the city with Joe Wilding and a couple of Iraqis and David Martinez, a independent filmmaker from the Bay Area. And we managed to get in on a bus carrying aid supplies in, donated by an NGO to be brought into a clinic. We were going to pick up wounded, see what we could, write down what we could, and then come back out that same day. We got into the city, went into a clinic and watched. I personally stayed at that clinic and watched over from that basically the middle of the day on well into the night, one after another of women, mostly women and small children being carried in, all from different parts of the city coming in at different times, all saying the same thing. We're being shot by American snipers. They can only push in so far into the city. Then they're lining the rooftops and they're shooting everything that moves. Of course, that in addition to cluster bombs being used, and this is the first siege we're talking about, not the second siege. Then fast forward to the second siege, which started on November 8, 2004. There was several months in between, where local people in Fallujah referred to it as the only liberated city in Iraq. But, of course, this was all just buying time for the military to A, get past the presidential election here on November 8, or I'm sorry, early in November, so that on November 8 they could go ahead and launch the siege and be well prepared for it. So that they did. And then, of course, in the November siege, while that was going on, I was in Baghdad. I was unable to make it into Fallujah, but I covered it the best I could by interviewing people as they came out of the city. I interviewed doctors and refugees and aid workers that had gone right up to the edge of the city. And I actually did go up to a couple of the small villages nearby Fallujah while that siege was going on. And that's how I was able to chronicle white phosphorus being used in Fallujah. At the time, I just referred to it as incendiary weapons, and I think I may have even called it napalm on an interview with Democracy Now! Because I didn't know what white phosphorus was at the time. But I was reporting doctors describing treating people, or bodies more accurately, that had been hit by it, and flesh being completely burnt off, treating people that were hit by a substance and it was burning them all the way down to the bone. They couldn't put it out with water. It was being used enough that people actually figured out how to use just dampened sand, make some mud and kind of put that on it because there was, of course, no medical aid in the city whatsoever. People describing very vividly what it looked like when it exploded and then again how it affected people. So I reported on that. By the end of that siege, thousands of Iraqis were dead. Iraqi NGOs operating inside the city estimate between 4,000 and 6,000 civilians were killed. 250,000 people displaced of a city of 350,000. To this day, tens of thousands of people have been unable to return to their homes. 70% of the city has been totally destroyed or damaged to the point of being unlivable. And the situation there is ongoing. To this day, the U.S. military has not had total control of all of the city at one point. Last last reports I had from one of my sources who actually lives in Fallujah said that every single day there's 5 attacks on U.S. military in or around the city and another 5 attacks on Iraqi security forces in or around that city. So it brings us just to come back up to present day. The other example I wanted to use, talking about how the propaganda is persisting regarding most mainstream reporters regarding the occupation. There was a play made which just finished a very successful 1-month run in London, a play called Fallujah. This play came about because there was a meeting held after a fair amount of time after the second siege of Fallujah, where British military commanders, British soldiers, one of the independent filmmakers that went into Fallujah with us during April, and a couple of other people came together. It was organized by a group called Peace Direct, and moderated, facilitated so that people could talk and exchange ideas and hopefully learn from each other, in order to prevent something like that from happening again. And the playwright, this man named Jonathan Holmes, was actually invited and sat in on this discussion, and during that point he decided, you know, I should make a play about this. This is really compelling stuff, interesting information from all sides. I'm going to make a play about this. So he did just that. He wrote the screenplay. In the play, the vast majority of the information in the play is based all on exact speeches given by U.S. generals, interviews with U.S. soldiers, speeches by Condoleezza Rice, interviews I did with Iraqis and Iraqi doctors, statements from Iraqis themselves. So it's a very, very factually based play, very, very well researched, and a very extraordinary play to see. One of the characters is an independent TV reporter that a lot of her script was from some of my writings and interviews that I'd done. And I put that out there as background just to show that on May 29, this May, the New York Times did a review of that play. A reporter by the name of Jane Perlez wrote the review. And one of the things that she wrote about this play, which again, as I said, it's factually based play, she wrote, quote, "The denunciations of the U.S. are severe, particularly in the scenes that deal with the use of napalm in Fallujah, an allegation made by left-wing critics of the war, but never substantiated." White phosphorus, just so you know, it uses kerosene as the fuel base. Napalm uses gasoline. Many people in the military and military analysts use the terms, kind of get lazy, but they use the terms simultaneously, napalm, white phosphorus, because they basically do the same thing. In fact, the military journal Field Artillery reported that white phosphorus was indeed used in Fallujah. Some of the IVAW folks have come out and spoken of it in public, that it was used with enough frequency that they call it Whiskey Pete is the call sign over the radio. That was another of the bits of information that came out in that year following the November 2004 siege. And then there was a Italian TV, Rai TV, ran a documentary about illegal weapons being used in Fallujah, and that kind of reopened the idea that maybe there were illegal weapons used in Fallujah, even though no one here would report on it. And so basically the Independent of London used a short version of one of my stories, and then some of this other information from the military journal, Iraq veterans, people like this, to run a series of articles that basically forced the Pentagon on November 15, 2005 to admit, yes, white phosphorus was used in Fallujah. U.S. Colonel Barry Venable said that about white phosphorus, quote, "Yes, it was used as an incendiary weapon against enemy combatants." Talking about Fallujah specifically. So the Pentagon, their spokesperson also specifically said, we used white phosphorus in Fallujah. And yes, it may have hit civilians. Even on November 29, then, 2 weeks after that admission by the military and the Pentagon, the New York Times wrote a very, very strong editorial against the use of white phosphorus. Again, it's an editorial. They didn't do a hard news story. They didn't report that the Pentagon admitted it, even after they had admitted it. But they did write this editorial. Part of that read, quote, "All of us, including Americans, are safer in a world in which certain forms of conduct are regarded as too inhumane, even for war. That is why the U.S. should stop using white phosphorus." Nevertheless, we have the New York Times writing a review of the play saying that no white phosphorus, no napalm was used in Fallujah. So I wrote them a correction because they made that mistake, and then they also called me a Canadian journalist and not an American journalist. So I wrote them a correction once, no response, twice, no response, third time, no response. Fourth time, I finally get a response. They say, okay, we're going to handle this. We're going to make a correction. About a few days later, and I was keeping the watchdog group FAIR in on this, by the way, and I thought it'd be a good idea. And they did run a correction, and they corrected that I am an American and not a Canadian. That was the correction. So, of course, FAIR did a really great job of writing up an action alert, a very well-researched, scathing action alert, getting the facts out there once again, urging people to contact the New York Times and, hey, why don't you maybe just report on this right for once? But I haven't seen if anything's come of that yet. I haven't heard that anything has. So anyway, my point being that it persists, but again, that's probably not a shocker to most of you. So what do we do about this? Always the vexing question for me, but I do want to end on a little bit of an up note, and I do think that there is reason to hope, even though this is such a horrible time in this country and even more so in the world with everything that's going on. But I personally believe that the so-called mainstream media in this country is dying, because I think that they've dug their own grave, and they're continuing to dig their own grave with their crap reportage. That's the bottom line. I think that it's our job as journalists, those of you that are activists, and especially those that are just simply concerned citizens of empire, to basically keep exposing the propaganda of the mainstream media, their lies, and their obedience to their government, their blind obedience most of the time. Keep spreading the factual, the true information that you can get your hands on. Keep educating yourselves and other people about the nature of this U.S. empire. And in these ways, I believe it's possible for all of us to work together to help the institutionalized media, the so-called mainstream media that currently exists in this country, to help it die a relatively peaceful death, and to usher in a real mainstream media, one that represents the real mainstream population of this country, since it is the majority of the people in this country today that are vehemently opposed to what's going on in Iraq, vehemently opposed to this government's policies regarding global warming. I could go on down the list, but it's clearer than ever today that there is no need to feel embattled if you're in this room and share the political beliefs of what folks have been talking about at this conference, that, the bottom line is we're the majority today. And it's time for us to have more of a media that really is a real mainstream media that's independent of state and corporate control. Thanks.